Well, I thought we'd start with a couple questions that I prepared beforehand, and then, then we can take it to the audience Q&A, go off-roading a little bit. So I thought maybe to start, I wanted to make sure I gave you all an opportunity to just respond to the video, give a live comment, and just curious for your thoughts generally on, sorry, Jorge, I'm totally doing a two-part question here, but on what we should do about this label of luxury housing. Do you think we should just get rid of it, or it's like not useful at all, or do you see applications where it is useful to call something out as luxury and all that? Who wants to go first? Oh gosh, or should I choose? I mean, Jean, I see you have a lot of notes in front of you. If you'd like to start.
Yeah, sure. Well, you asked me. Can you hear this?
Maybe if you bring it a little closer, or if it's not on. Oh.
Hello, hello.
Hey, there we are.
Okay. You said I had voted against market housing, and what do I think of these pro-supply arguments when it comes to housing crisis? So I thought I would answer that.
Oh, absolutely.
So where I'm coming from is I was the only person on council who wasn't a supply addict. And I tried to carve out a role for myself to push for affordability for low-income people. And that's what I did. It doesn't mean I don't think we need more housing. I think we do need more housing. But I'm saying that the housing we get should be in proportion to what people can afford. So the median renter income is about 66 grand, which means you can afford $1,600 a month for rent. It's way worse for people on welfare, disability, basic pension, minimum wage. Even the median income for a single person, all you can afford is $1,050. So this is where my priorities are. Nothing is going to filter down to those people. And anyone in these groups is absolutely terrified of what's going to happen if they lose their housing. The supportive housing wait list in Vancouver has 3,000 people on it. The social housing wait list has 5,000 people on it. And we have 4,000 homeless people. I think the pro-supply arguments are just plain wrong about Vancouver anyway. So let me ask you and answer truthfully. How many of you know of someone who has moved out of an apartment and then the next person who moved in had to pay a way higher rent? Okay, so the rent doesn't go down. In Vancouver, the rent goes up. And I have an impeccable source for that who actually did another video kind of like yours supporting this supply filtering theory. CMHC.
They made a video?
They did.
Wow. Yeah.
But anyway, this isn't from the video. They say the average asking rent for vacant in 2023, quote, the average asking rent for vacant units was 43% higher than the overall average for rent in occupied units. And then they say, which I thought was humorous, interestingly, now this is interesting because it contradicts their filtering theory, average rents for new two-bedroom units were nearly identical to the asking rent for vacant two-bedroom units of all ages. So actually the new units were cheaper than the older ones. So filtering isn't working in Vancouver. It might work if we had vacancy control and lots of social housing that low-income people can afford. And that's what happened in the 70s. We had tens of thousands of units of social housing being built. We had vacancy control, so landlords couldn't raise your rent as much as they want when the tenant leaves. And we had hardly any homelessness. You guys are all young, you probably can't remember that, but there was a time when we didn't have much. So yeah, I don't want to take up the whole time, but I thought I'd start out with that.
Yeah, really starting out with a banger. I have to say, and I really want to reiterate, Jean, I'm so glad that you're here to bring your perspective to this video and to this issue, because I definitely wanted to be challenged on this topic. And I'm not here to say like, I'm a YouTuber. Can't pretend. It's a good thing that I'm not in charge of housing policy or decisions to some extent.
So maybe Uytae, we can get you to do a video on how to end homelessness. I'll help you with it.
Well, and I want to make sure I get a chance for the other panelists to kind of weigh in on this too. But I will say sort of kind of my reflection to your thoughts, and sort of while I was making the video, like sort of a searing question I still had in my head was, while we're pursuing, or while we have market housing developments happening, could that sort of system still create affordability for some of the sort of like for deeply lower income individuals in the city, and I think there is some sobering thoughts to be had about a purely market-driven approach to housing. It seems like it might work very well in theory, but I can tell you, visiting San Francisco, they're also really struggling with it as well. And it seems like to your point, I won't maybe get into too much of it, but would anyone else on the panel like to take a stab at this one?
I was telling Tom that I think the video did such a great job of summing it up. I was like, I don't even know what else there is to contribute to this conversation. But I think when I think about the term luxury housing, I think you really have to question, like, what are you trying to define? Are you trying to say that this housing that's being built is too expensive and I can't afford it, which is a valid criticism, I think? Or are we trying to argue the other thing, which is that it's excessive and it shouldn't be built because it's like too luxurious, right? And so I think those are different things. And if we're talking about the latter, then it kind of becomes a subjective moving target, right? Because something that I can't afford, that is too expensive, say, a mansion in Shaughnessy that's getting demoed and reconstructed, that to me is excessive and luxurious, especially in the context of it's 10 minutes from downtown. That is a luxury that, the way that we use that piece of land is very luxurious in the sense that lots of people could be living there. Can we afford for this luxury right in the middle of our city? But that's like a completely separate tangent, I think. And so going back to the first point of new housing being expensive, I think that your video does a really good summary of why that is. And having worked in development, I guess for almost the last decade, you do see that costs continue to increase, right? I've worked in non-market, I've worked in market housing, and new housing is just expensive to build. And so when I work on work on an apartment building that is non-market or affordable, it's just barely below market. And yet I still see everyone applying way beyond the income limits, trying to get in because they themselves can't find housing for them. So that to me shows that we need a lot more supply, both on the luxury end, but also on the subsidized non-market side. And I think both can exist. We don't have to only promote one or the other. And what Jean and other advocates do for arguing for a lot of shelter rate housing, a lot of housing that is actually can be afforded by people with lower incomes, is super important, because that's how we get governments to provide more funding, which then goes towards the nonprofits, the housing providers that can actually use those subsidies to create the deeply affordable units that a luxury developer can't provide.
Kind of a follow-up to your point, like, is there a line where a developer, like as a developer, you would consider your development to be specifically catering to a luxury clientele? Is it the granite countertops? Is it, maybe if we can kind of, put some more like definitions around it, like, is there sort of like a type of development where you could say like, this is cut and dry, catered towards a luxury client?
I'm sure there are developers that cater to that. Like, there are groups that I would never work for because that's not the type of projects that I would want to develop, but I'm sure there are. But I think there's a misconception that luxury means like the best high-end countertops. Because if I were to take a full budget cost and break out all the different things that I have to pay for in order to build a building, granite countertops versus I can't remember, laminate. Yeah, Formica or laminate is like a rounding error in terms of the difference, right? The biggest difference might be, do I want double pane or triple pane windows? Do I want a wood frame versus a concrete? Like those are the big differences if we're going to talk about what's an extra excessive cost. Whether your faucet is top of the line Kohler or something, that's a rounding error, but I think that's what gets presented out there in the market as this makes this luxury.
Interesting. Well, really appreciate your insight, Helen. And then finally, Tom, I thought you have the last word on the video.
Well, first.
Oh, yeah,
So
we're
first
good.
of all, thank you so much for having me, and just a fantastic film, and I was in 100% agreement with Helen Lui. Just whatever, drop the mic, you're done. You did a great job. So, maybe I'll just emphasize a couple of things that I thought were terrific and could maybe get built upon, and then maybe take a second to respond to some of what was said earlier about low income. So, first of all, the San Francisco point was very important, and maybe I'd augment it with, you see rents rising and new buildings going up.
Tom, if you don't mind, can you hold the mic a little closer to your face?
Yes.
I think that might help.
Okay.
Is that better? Okay.
I mean, I like the static. I want to really dig in here. But I don't think a landlord in Kitsilano needs a new building to figure out that they can raise rents, right? So the rents are going to rise anyway. But in the neighborhoods where rents are rising the most, that's where it's going to be most attractive for Helen's for-profit counterparts to come in and tear down older rentals and build new buildings. So what are you going to see? The neighborhoods that get new buildings have rising rents. But it isn't the new buildings that caused the rising rents, it's the rising rents that caused the new buildings. But, an economist says that, and somebody who's getting rent evicted says, well, who am I supposed to believe? My lying eyes or your special model? But I think the reality is building the new building per se, while causing displacement potentially, and that needs to be dealt with, the new building itself is not the cause of the rising rents. Now, when units turn over because of rent control, it is true that units get marked to market, but that's kind of inevitable. And I think we run the risk of putting ourselves in a trap where incumbent tenants just hold on for dear life and don't want any change in the neighborhood, totally rationally, because individually they just pray and pray that they're not going to get thrown out of their house. But if you don't build any new housing, and people are just going to get increasingly desperate to never get thrown out because there's no place else to live, and it is going to be the coders, the children of rich parents, whatever it is, who get the fancy units. So building new housing is, lowers rents, as you mentioned, by filtering, which is absolutely a real phenomenon. We've seen it. And today's new buildings are tomorrow's old buildings. And it is a very clear pattern, notwithstanding what Jean said, it is absolutely true. Rents fall by about 20% as a building ages 20 or 30 years and gets depreciated. So it is true that today's new buildings are tomorrow's affordable supply, and you suck up the top of the demand curve, and that opens up the basement suites for more moderate income households. So that's the new supply piece. The other point you mentioned that Helen addressed was the zoning at the end. The true luxury is single family zoning, and it's just hard to express what an evil that is to have the government enforce a rule that says, okay, so you need to make $500,000 basically to afford a single-family home. A new single-family home, I guess you need about an $800,000 income to afford. So why would the government say, well, let's enforce a rule that unless you make $800,000, you're not allowed to live on 70% of the land in Greater Vancouver? I mean, it's an outrage. It's really, really bad. Let me talk a little bit about...
There you go.
Let me talk a little bit about luxury. Because I don't know if you've probably seen these things, well, if you're as hyper-Twitterized as I am, you've seen these listings that look really not that nice. These are in the brand new buildings. They're small, they're dark, 500 square feet, oh yay, you know, like a fake granite countertop, awesome. You know, maybe to drop the 50 grand on the $1 million price to make it real granite. But this is not luxury. The luxury is that you have a roof over your head in Vancouver, which unfortunately, well, or for better or worse, it's a great city, and you know, it's a lot better than most of the world, and so people are desperate to be here, and there's not enough homes, and so the luxury is you get a home. Now, what do we do about the fact, so what is an affordable housing problem? It's two problems. It's there's not enough homes, and so who here makes, sorry for the show of hands, who makes over 100K and feels stressed about affordability in this room? Their household makes more than 100,000, and yet they feel stressed. All right, if you don't want to raise your hand, how about you think the person sitting next to you, their household probably makes over 100K, and they feel stressed. Okay, so who thinks their neighbor makes more than 100,000 in their household and feels stressed about housing? Okay, a lot of you, right? So that's 100K. Jean's 30,000 a year people or less, that's a horror show trying to make it in Vancouver.
Right.
So what's the problem? The problem is that they make less than 30K a year. They need more money and they need more homes. The question is, should the builders be responsible both for providing the homes and transferring resources to low-income households? And the answer is no, because then you're asking too much of the builders, right? I mean, it's very expensive to build, and if you have to be an anti-poverty machine as well as trying to build houses, there's no way it's going to work, and nobody will build any homes, and the affordability problem will just stretch up and up past 100,000, past 200,000. You know, believe me, you can feel stressed over 100K. So we need more homes. Desperately. The new homes aren't particularly luxurious. The luxurious part isn't what creates the unaffordability, it's the lack of housing. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. And I hear, oh, sure, if you want to clap. There's a lot to think about there and a lot to respond to there, but I thought maybe it might be worthwhile, like, kind of just hearing all your thoughts on this issue. Is there any way to sort of reconcile our different perspectives on this? I mean, I think Jean's perspective is an incredibly valid one in that, you know, I think there are individuals in Vancouver, communities where I'm just not sure that a market solution could ever work, or that, you know, yeah, that like even if we did sort of see it as a bigger picture thing, I don't like. I don't feel smart enough to even like try to say this, but then at the same time, I feel like, you know, there is this bigger picture of filtering and vacancy chains of like that. It's undeniable that, you know, housing is an interconnected system, and that changes at the high end can still make their way down, you know, to other parts of the market. I don't know if anyone on the panel want to take a stab at like, is there a way, like, is market housing, for example, Jean, like, is market housing appropriate in any kind of neighborhood in Vancouver? Or, I don't know, for you, Tom, like, are there weaknesses within the market itself that, like, you know, we could never really expect to produce deep affordability for individuals?
So I'll give it a try.
For sure.
Is this working?
Oh, yeah.
Is that better?
There we go.
I think the market is fine for people who can afford to pay for market housing, and I don't believe that. I mean, and I think it's better if new housing gets built in single-family areas rather than in existing apartment areas. Like Shaughnessy would be a great choice.
Yeah, like Shaughnessy.
I'd love to see, 500 units of supportive housing right next to the Crescent. But on the other hand, what the problem is that the type of housing that's being built is way out of proportion to where the need is. Like the city just had a housing target report, and they set these targets that are if you're a low-income person, the targets that they set are way lower than what they say is the need. 20% of the need for low-income people, or their targets are set at 20% of the need. But for higher-income people, the targets are set at over 200% of the need. Why is that? It's because the targets are based on what the city thinks senior governments will fund. And senior governments have to be the ones that fund housing for lower income people. Except, and I think this is where some luxury housing comes in, as part of the city's targets, they want to try and extract affordability out of luxury housing.
Right.
Like one of the things you didn't mention in the video is that when you have these luxury towers, you rezone and you increase the value of the land by a lot. And so in my brain, what we should be doing is capturing that increased value in affordability. So the city, when I was there anyway, their theory was try and capture 75% of the increased value in affordability or in a child care center or something. So that means that since you're only getting 20% affordability in a rental place,
Right. 20% of the units
are
being,
affordable, and the city's definition of affordable is about $1,000 a month for a bachelor, so it still doesn't count people on welfare, disability, minimum wage, basic pension. So they're building all this luxury housing so they can get, I think, they wanted to get an extra 5,500 units of below market housing. But in order to do that, they have to build a lot of luxury housing. So we need to change the system so it's more market oriented, and so that the housing that gets built actually meets the affordability needs of the people who exist. I was talking to this guy that we were doing a survey for our housing report, for a report on homelessness, and we had a little questionnaire, and I was talking to him on Hastings Street. He was outside the Aboriginal front door where they have storage bins so homeless people can store their stuff and then come and get their stuff and change it and stuff. And one of the questions was, if you were offered a place in a tent city or a place in a tiny home, like 8 by 8 with a bed and a lock on the door, which would you like that? And this guy, he was a senior, he was very depressed. And we were chatting away, and I asked him this question, and for the first time in the whole conversation, his eyes kind of lit up, and he said, "I'd give my left arm for a tiny home." So that's some people's definition of luxury.
Right.
So we really need to push hard on our governments, especially the federal government, which has been really missing in action when it comes to housing for low-income people, to put money actually into housing that low-income people need, rather than to say, oh, I can get a photo op by giving a low-interest loan to this luxury housing and say that I'm creating X number of units of social housing when poor people can't even dream of getting in it. So I'm just here arguing like, oh, you folks that are about, I'm 3 times as old as most of you. We desperately need...
I won't ask.
Desperately need more pressure on the senior governments for more non-market housing, or that kind of terror at losing your home and being on the street is going to just get worse. I'll shut up.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Jean. Yeah. Tom, I want to give you a comment, but actually I was just realizing we have someone who actually has built quite a bit of non-market housing on our panel. Our wonderful panelist, Helen, you used to work for Catalyst Developments, and I think you've got a bit of a pulse. If you don't mind me putting this question on to you, kind of in response to some of Jean's comments, like how do you see like some of that deeply affordable housing being built, like what are some of those systemic changes that you think would be required to kind of achieve that?
Yeah, there's a couple responses. I think, Jean, what you were thinking or speaking to, maybe inclusionary zoning, where we try and require and extract a certain level of affordability. And personally, my view is that I don't particularly like inclusionary zoning, though I do think that overall in our market we should be encouraging, enforcing, and ensuring the outcome that there are sufficient affordable units that are created. And so I'm going to go on a tiny tangent on that for a little bit. And it's that planners, I love planners, but I don't like working with you folks whenever I actually have to do a development. And if anybody else is terminally online like I am, you'll probably note that I have tons of rants about the most ridiculous things that I've been told to do on my projects from planners. And I think it's this tension, right? It's that planners are trying really hard to extract really important, really beneficial things for the community, but at the same time, perhaps they don't see the flip side of what it actually causes onto the projects. So I think it was maybe a month or so ago, there was an Urbanarium event looking at the changes that have happened to the building code since, like, I don't know, for the last 30 years. And I think we saw like an image of building code being like this thick as a book in, I don't know, I don't want to name a date because they'll probably be wrong. But then you look at the most recent one and it's like volume 1 of 8 is like this big, right? And so that is what has happened when you look at all the regulations and all the rules and all the hoops you have to jump through to actually get a building built, right? And so that is why costs have gone up so much. And adding this rule of trying to extract a certain portion assumes that we have a perfect math figured out as to what that ratio can be on any given site, on any property across the city. And the reality is the math on a given project is really different depending on what site you're in. Like if I have a completely flat site, that's much easier to build on compared to a site that's got a slope that's increased, like, I don't know, I probably pay an extra $500K just to deal with the civil that you have to figure out because of the slope, right? So if we're just saying blanket statement, every single project, 15% of the units have to be shelter, that might result in a whole bunch of sites then suddenly that don't get built.
But what about the increased value from extra density? Shouldn't some of that be recaptured for the community?
Totally, yeah. And I think that for me, I would rather see that nonprofits, non-market developers, and developers that are currently in the space of delivering more affordable units be empowered to create that level of affordability. And I guess to answer your previous question of how do we then move forward and kind of address some of these key issues, zoning is obviously a big one. And number 2, like I mentioned, I'd love to see a lot of those regulations come down, right? Every year we're adding a new rule, a new planning policy, a new building code. We never take out old stuff that don't make sense anymore, right? So that's 2. And then all of those things apply as well for non-market and nonprofit developers, but they also need to work within subsidies that are available. So the only way for them to create more affordability, to build more buildings that are below market, that are deeply affordable, is if they get those subsidies, if they get that funding from the government. And that changes every year. BC Housing changes their way that they fund their programs every year. CMHC does changes all the time. So I think that there is an important advocacy piece there to continue getting governments to provide more funding, to make sure that their subsidies, if they're asking for, hey, we should be building way more shelter units, the subsidies have to be in there for that to be able to happen. Right. Because non-markets and non-profit developers pay all the exact same fees as a regular market developer. The only piece that makes the new units affordable is the subsidy. And I think people don't think about that. People think maybe, oh, it's affordable because they're not taking a profit. No, it's affordable because there's a subsidy that's been given by the government into that project.
So you're saying like the profit actually doesn't result in that much of a cost savings overall for a nonprofit?
Yeah, I don't think so, because we're still paying ourselves. Like when I worked for a nonprofit, I wasn't working for free, right? I'm paying myself. My architect was still taking a profit. All the 30 consultants I had to hire was still taking a profit. Every single person along the chain takes a profit. So it's nonprofit, but it's just one person out of like the 400 people involved on the project that was not taking a profit.
Oh, fascinating. Tom, I know you raised your hand earlier, so I want to make sure to come back to you if you wanted to add anything else. Or
Well, maybe I'd just try and synthesize a little.
Yeah.
Maybe we all agree that saying, hey, you've got to provide affordable housing for people who make $90,000 a year, so I don't know, you charge $3,000 rent instead of like spending a little bit of extra money on granite countertops, and you charge $5,000 rent. That's a giant sacrifice on the part of the developer, and you're getting pretty minimal affordability out of that. I think it would just be much, much, much more efficient to say, do whatever you want, but we know you can break even on $3,000 a month rent, so we're going to grab $2,000 a month rent, and we're going to take the money and we're going to give it to people who need cash, who would be just that senior guy who sounded like his big problem was that he was just low income. And so give him cash and let him figure out how to spend it, instead of having, a firefighter and a teacher who are probably going to be fine, stand on a giant line to get an apartment that's intentionally designed to be yucky because it's the nonprofit space. It's just much, much, much more efficient because you don't need to give that old man. He'd be so happy to get a basement suite or something like that if only he had enough cash. You don't need to give him a brand new apartment that has this tremendously high opportunity cost. It's just really, really wasteful, and you don't get the affordability. So let the new stuff, let the developer go to town on luxury, and then you get more money to do more good for society. It's just a tremendous waste of resources to think that we're going to have a solution to poverty with brand new housing. That's silly. If you gave low-income people the cash value of the subsidy they're getting, they wouldn't consume a brand new luxury apartment. They'd eat better food, they'd get a better home, they'd get better clothes, they'd do all kinds of things. It's just insane to put low-income housing in brand new buildings. Where it's not, where there is a place for that, I think, is people who need supports. So, you can think about going to the downtown east side and saying, here, everybody, here's a bunch of cash. I don't think that's going to, it'll solve some people's problems, but not everybody's problems by any means. And then, if you're fleeing domestic violence or something like that, you probably need a special place for that. So you can think about special circumstances where you have to have dedicated housing. But generally speaking, let developers build what they want with the new housing, and I absolutely believe extract cash. Now, how you extract cash is tricky because, as Helen mentioned, you're going to make either kind of mistake. You're going to charge too much in some cases, and the deal gets killed and there's no housing at all, and then you'll leave money on the table in other cases because you didn't want to kill that deal. You make the ask too small, and then something like Vancouver House pays too little, and you just get a chandelier.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a very different way to look at it. It's like maybe we're overcomplicating it by trying to build the perfect thing. It's sort of just let people build whatever they want, but then extract value from that just in pure cash and redistribute it.
It's called the second welfare theorem for anybody who's curious.
Fancy. I believe I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. So if you don't mind me moving on, I know we could talk at length about this. Does anyone in the audience have a question? I don't have a mic, unfortunately, but I saw your hand up there first. Do you want to try projecting?
So isn't it the job of government to regulate the free market? And wasn't one of the fundamental powers or tools of government is to tax the rich and wealth and redistribute those back to the people who need the help at the bottom? So why is government not doing what they were originally intended to do? Tax the wealth and the riches of those who have benefited from the system and the resources of the land, and then redistribute that to the people who need it the most? Why has government failed or refused to do their original job?
It sounds like you and Tom might be on the same page there, actually. And I think, what this brings up for me is I guess there's like this big question of like, how do we redistribute wealth? And I think, Helen, to your point, right now, it seems like we extract a lot of value from housing, but I've always thought like, are there other places where, maybe property taxes or I don't know, or maybe we make parking meters really, really, really expensive, and those are other. Oh, okay, that got a clap. Sorry, Jean, did you have something you wanted to?
Yeah.
Oh, if you just flick it up, yeah.
We could have a mansion tax.
Now we're talking.
I tried that when I was on council. The province has to give the city can only have a flat tax on property. You have to pay the same rate if you have a condo or if you are Chip Wilson that has a $60-some million mansion. Right. Chip Wilson could build enough housing to house every homeless person in Vancouver, new housing, and still have $5 billion left. So we definitely need a mansion or wealth tax. And one way of getting a partial wealth tax would be to have a mansion tax, but it could be on income, it could be on wealth, it could be on property. That's a great idea, Norm. Let's all work for a wealth tax, you guys.
Just quickly, normally I would say, no, just tax income and let people spend money how they want. But Vancouver is a little bit different. The average owner, or the median owner, if you lined up all the owners of homes in the top 5% of value in Greater Vancouver, the guy in the middle pays $15,000 a year in income tax. And it should be about $400,000 if they were buying that house with income earned locally. So we have a bit of a screwy thing because Vancouver's a nice place to have money more than a place to make money. And so I think probably that redistribution has to happen somewhat through property taxes, not just on construction.
Another thing we could do, especially with like a mansion tax or other taxes, is we could give some back to Indigenous nations so they could retrieve the land that's theirs in the first place.
There's an idea. I'm going to take a question from this side of the room as well, and then I'll come back to this side. I see a hand at the very back first.
You talk about how, in the video, you talked about how the discourse is dominated by people not wanting luxury housing. I have always perceived that as just a rhetorical thing. I've always perceived that as NIMBYism, making an excuse to oppose density, and just as a rhetorical thing. So, do you perceive that as a fully genuine, like, we think that this is actually not going to solve housing unaffordability, or like, how much of that do you and all the panelists think is just purely rhetorical and just an excuse to oppose density rather than oppose something that they don't think is going to solve unaffordability?
That's a very interesting question, one that I thought about, and if you don't mind me quickly trying to talk about it, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video was I definitely heard that refrain come up over and over again around any kind of newish looking housing development in the city. And for sure, I think mixed into sort of the opposition of housing is, all kinds of different opinions that you can't really quite easily, parse out who's really thinking this way or that way. But my feeling was to kind of take that argument in good faith, to say, okay, if the actual concern here is luxury housing, from my view and kind of the research I did, I felt that you could just take that head on and without necessarily making it out to be just sort of a cover for NIMBYism. So that's been my thought about it, is for sure I'm, folded into that argument probably is some amount of just, I don't like change in my neighborhood, or I don't want, this sort of type of person to live in my neighborhood. But I think even if you take the argument at face value that luxury housing would raise rents in a neighborhood, or new market rate rent housing would raise rents in a neighborhood, I think there are some compelling arguments I've found to kind of to counter that.
So
yeah.
take the example. Take the example of the Grandview Towers that you had in the first part of your video. Huge towers, unaffordable housing.
Right.
That is going to transform that neighborhood completely, not just because of the housing, but because the people that live in the expensive housing are going to have more income, and they're going to change the businesses in the neighborhood. So the businesses are going to start catering to wealthier people, and the people who don't live in the towers, who aren't wealthy, who depend on businesses that have lower prices, are going to get priced out. If the towers, in my opinion, if the towers included social housing that actually didn't exclude low-income people, then it would be a different story in terms of the impact on the neighborhood.
I mean, Tom, I see you shaking your head at it.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to push back on that. Again, landlords in Grandview Woodlands know they can charge high rents now, and I mean, I don't think the ability to buy retail at a junky retailer is really what's helping people hold on. I think it's their rent control, which is helpful for sure. And again, you do have to deal with that. Let me just.
You agree with rent control, vacancy control?
No, you know what vacancy control is and rent control? Rent control is a property tax that only hits you if you're a landlord, and really hits you if you decide to, if you screw up and don't select tenants who are likely to churn. And I don't think those are good incentives. I would say a broader-based property tax would be a better idea. As a politician, I'd go with rent control, though, because landlords are a very small voting bloc. I just want to say one thing, which is, I sort of think maybe I could come off as, like, what is the difference between economics and QAnon? And I say that and I say that in the sense of, if I'm some person in a neighborhood, and I see, a bunch of towers went up and they cost a lot of money and rents are generally rising, well, duh, luxury housing creates unaffordability, and it's probably through the channel Gene mentioned, which is now, instead of like bad coffee, it's slightly better coffee at a higher price. So that's just stands to reason. And then some, economist comes in and says, oh, no, there's a supply and demand model that you're ignoring. And what happened was demand was growing in the neighborhood, and that pushed up rent, and that caused the building. And you tell this whole convoluted story. But I think for a normal human being, all you'd see is, well, the building went up and rents are going up. So yes, there's NIMBYism, and yes, it's a convenient set of beliefs to hold, that the new housing is non-helpful and actually makes things worse. But at the same time, I think it's easy to see how somebody without that model in their head could have a different belief. And now I wonder, maybe I'm living in some kind of fantasy world where there's supply and demand.
Yeah.
I just have a very short response. I was going to say, I sort of think that it's irrelevant what their intention is, of whether it's NIMBYism or some other genuine concern about change in the neighborhood, and therefore that's why they call it luxury housing. I kind of feel that the term is reflective of a lot of ways that this whole housing discourse has become really reductive into kind of like, I can't think of the term, but just like zingers, right? Like a hotline that you can say that is like either you're for it or not, right? And as you can see, like we all don't agree on very many different things. And in order to move forward, we need an actual deeper discussion and figure out the ways and areas where there's a Venn diagram of where we agree. Like perhaps let's go for Shaughnessy, like let's look at property taxes, right? And so, equally, you could argue for people who go to a public hearing and they support, new housing in their development, like, is it because they genuinely believe in supply and demand, or is it because they're planning to sell their home next year and they want their property value to go up, and therefore they're like, yeah, I'm going to support this so then I can move out and make lots of money. So it's kind of, I think, irrelevant in the big picture of like, how do we move forward? How do we get people all kind of coming together on the important parts to do the things that are needed in order to make the changes to improve the situation?
I love that point. Maybe we have time for one more question. I'm seeing a hand over there at in the salmon shirt.
Yeah, so considering the fact that we saw the chart where 431% of the price increase was from government regulation, building codes, and everything, right? How do we start the process of cutting back on that so we can make things act like more affordable in general? Like, where would we start bringing that? It's clearly a large increase.
Yeah.
I have lots of thoughts on this.
I'm sure you do. Yeah.
If you look at the whole process of how long it takes for me to start a project to actually start construction, it's at least 3 years. And at least a year of 2 is sitting through committees, listening to a certain similar type of people tell me what they think of the building and the way it looks, or what color the siding should be, or whether this sidewalk is like appropriate for this side of the building. As an example, I spent 6 months recently on a building near King George Station that is a high-rise rental, 19-story. I was told by city staff for 6 months to go back and rework the design at least 3 or 4 times to make a high-rise look less like a high-rise. Right? So you asked me where the costs come from. Well, I had to pay 10 different consultants for 6 months of salary to try and see if they could make a big building look less big. So I think there's a fundamental change perhaps in the belief of like, what are we trying to get out of this building when we build a new building? Is it super important that it looks like super attractive to the person who's gonna walk down the street and look up on the 20th story? I don't know, that's very subjective. But there are some things that are building codes, for example, building life and safety. Perhaps those are not things that we take out, but maybe there's an opportunity that we look at all the other regulations and we go, okay, like, is this really necessary? Do we really need a panel and committee of people to review what they think about the aesthetic qualities of a building, right? Those probably have a variety. Because if I ask everyone in the room, if you were given an option to have slightly less expensive new buildings, but they look a little shittier, would you be okay with that? Like, maybe the siding's a little weird and it's like a bright red, I don't know, instead of like a nice whatever, right? Like, it's those things. So that's my take.
Yeah, of course, Jay.
If I could add, at Carnegie, we've boiled our 42 recommendations down to 3 things: stop the loss, build new shelter-aid housing, and treat people humanely who are homeless in the meantime. So under stop the loss, one thing that could stop the loss of affordability really quick is vacancy control. Steve Pomeroy has done research that shows that we've lost affordability in 47,000 units in Vancouver in the last 5 years. Vacancy control would stop most of that. In order to replace that housing with new housing, it would cost about $6 billion a year, because we're losing affordability in about at least 6,000 purpose-built rentals every year, according to CMHC. It would cost about, $3 billion to replace that. So stop the loss, that's the first thing, and you could do a lot of it with vacancy control. Build new. One way to get around all that difficulty would be if we could have like a Crown Corporation or some government that just built it. I was talking to Helen about this earlier. I know one guy who's an architect who's involved in Indigenous housing who had to get money from 27 sources for one project. That's ridiculous. We need somebody that can just build the housing and do it fast. And then, as Helen says, it takes a long time, like 3 years is nothing. I've worked on 58 West Hastings, which just opened. I've been working on that since 2006. And other people put a lot of effort into it and had to raise a lot of private money for it. So we have to treat people who are homeless humanely in the meantime, which means we have to open more shelters and we have to have tiny home villages, which give people a little bit of privacy. So.
I think it seems like we're aligned in that we could generally use a little less process and, time and getting, urgently needed housing developed. And I think that's certainly a start. I guess, Sorry. I don't do this often, you guys. I'm not used to hosting a panel or anything like that. But I think, that might be a good place for us to end it.